The dark web is a grim place, a pit where humanity's worst instincts thrive, and it's where I work. I'm what's known as a white hat, a kind of good guy hacker paid to tear down vile markets, map the trails that lead to the monsters hiding in the shadows, and shine a sort of light into that darkness. Most days I sit in front of my screens, the glow of my monitors the only light in my small, cluttered apartment, as my fingers fly over the keyboard, piercing layers of encrypted filth and exposing secrets no one else dares to look for. It's my job, and it's not for the faint of heart, but I'm goddamn good at it. I've seen horrors beyond imagination, things no one should ever witness, but the case that haunts me started on a day like any other. A routine sweep led to a marketplace buried deep in the web's underbelly. It advertised human lives as commodities, young and old, with glossy images and cold descriptions. I'd seen it before, but this one had a different aura, polished, professional, and insidiously quiet. A digital fortress, almost daring anyone to try to break in. I remember digging into its code and unraveling the layers of security, sort of like peeling an onion. It was very slow and grueling and frustrating work, and the site had a grotesque elegance to it, its defenses crafted by someone who knew what they were doing. But no system is impenetrable, and by the end of the third day, I was in. The database was rather vast, with entries detailing victims, names, ages, photos, and chillingly precise descriptions of their usefulness. Each profile was a silent scream, a plea buried in ones and zeros, and I started extracting the data, piecing together patterns and names and connections, and as always, I logged everything meticulously, building a dossier that might help the authorities when I was done dismantling the site. Then I found her, a girl from the Philippines, and she couldn't have been more than 12. Her photo showed a child with wide, frightened eyes and a forced smile. Her profile was detailed in a way that made my stomach churn. And something about her entry stood out, though. An odd note in the metadata, a small breadcrumb someone had left behind. It was a payment log, and it didn't lead to a buyer. It led back to her family. I ran her name through every database I had access to, cross-referencing missing persons reports, social media posts, and news articles, and the trail was faint, but it was there. She disappeared months ago, her last known sighting in a small village. The local news barely mentioned it, and her parents never reported her missing. Instead, their lives had taken a very curious turn. I found pictures of them on Facebook, standing in front of a newly built house. Posts bragging about a blessing that had come their way. Expensive clothes, lavish parties, smiles plastered across their faces. It just didn't add up. Where does a poor family suddenly get that kind of money? The pieces clicked together, a grotesque puzzle I wish that I hadn't solved. They sold her. Their own flesh and blood, handed over to monsters for a better life. I stared at the screen, bile rising up in my throat ready to vomit, and it wasn't just the marketplace. It was the betrayal, the abandonment, the cold calculations that turned a child into currency. I've always kept my work professional, very detached, but this time I couldn't stop thinking about her. She wasn't just a name in a database anymore. She was a girl who had been discarded like trash, her life ripped apart by the people who were supposed to love her most. I dug deeper into her family. Bank records, private messages, anything I could find. Every transaction told a story, and the trail was very damning. The deposit that coincided with her disappearance, the gradual splurge on luxuries, they weren't just complicit, they were thriving off her suffering. The more I uncovered, the more I felt anger creeping in. My work had always been about dismantling systems, not judging individuals, but this felt very personal. Her image haunted me, that forced smile and the terror in her eyes. I just couldn't shake it no matter how hard I tried. I'd been compiling evidence for weeks, building a case that would hold up under scrutiny, and the authorities would take it from there, and that's how it always worked. But with each passing day, the thought of her family living in comfort while she suffered gnawed at me. They'd bought their happiness with her life. It was just monstrous. One night, as I sifted through the last of the data, I made a decision. I wouldn't just hand over the evidence and walk away. I would make them feel the weight of what they'd done. They couldn't be allowed to forget her, to erase her like she was nothing. I crafted an email, anonymous and untraceable, attaching photos of their daughter from the marketplace, blurred enough to protect her dignity, but unmistakable. I sent it to them with no words, just images. I wanted them to see her, to remember what they'd done. I'll never know if they opened it, but I imagined the guilt festering inside them like a rot. It wasn't justice, but it was something. The marketplace was gone within days, wiped clean from the dark web. My work there was done, and the authorities had the evidence they needed to start tracking that network. But her face has stayed with me, a ghost that I couldn't exorcise. I like to think that she's still alive somewhere, that the system I helped dismantle gave her a chance at freedom. But I know better. The dark web doesn't just let go of its victims easily. Still, I keep working, tearing down one monster at a time, because if I don't, who will? In early 2013, I was working for a large market research company here in New York City. I'd been there 6 years, I was very happy, and my career prospects were bright. And then one day, everything changed. It was a Wednesday morning, and after waking up at 6:15, I completed my morning routine and then walked down to the parking lot of my building. Mine was one of maybe 12 to 14 in the lot, and then, as I'm walking toward it, I saw a lone figure leaning up against the wall near the hood of my car. It seemed to be a young man, early to late 20s, wearing a ball cap and hoodie, and as I walked to my car, the guy just kind of stared at me. I held his gaze, pretty cautious but not confrontational, and then as I got to my car, I asked if I could help him. Again, I wasn't overly confrontational about it, but he was standing by my car and quite obviously staring at me, so I figured I'd better work out what his deal was before I unlocked the door. I asked him, "Can I help you?" And then without skipping a beat, he replied, "Can't nobody help you, homie." I figured he was just trying to be a smartass, so I decided not to engage him any further. Just got into my car and then started backing up out of my parking space. But then as I did, and the whole time, hoodie guy is just sort of staring at me, grinning from ear to ear, like his little "can't nobody help you, homie" thing was the dunk of all dunks. And on the drive to work, I got cut off or flipped off maybe a dozen times, all in the space of 30 minutes. And then by the time one of my boss's pain-in-the-ass midweek meetings were finished, I had practically forgotten all about that hoodie guy and his very nonsensical quip. And I went about my day as usual, which is actually a pretty busy one too, so it wasn't until late in the afternoon that the encounter popped into my head again. Assuming the guy was there to steal a car, or maybe pull a smash and grab to score some valuables, somebody in my apartment building was about to have a really bad day. But little did I know, even though my car was safely in the employee parking lot, it was still me that was about to have that really bad day. And so, the working day ends, I drive back home, and as I'm pulling into the parking lot, I'm not seeing any broken windows or broken glass in my empty parking spaces, so I figured that we got off lucky. But then, after I walked upstairs to the floor my apartment was on, I turned a corner on my corridor, and I see it. Or, more accurately, I smell it. Someone had pooped all over my door. Not like a regular poop either. I'm talking like liquid diarrhea from the spray pattern, and it looked like it had hit my door with considerable force. And I remember just staring at it for a second, in complete disbelief, thinking, please God, no. This can't be freaking happening right now. And then when the smell hit my nostrils, I had to cover up my nose and mouth to keep from gagging. I walked right back down to my car, called an emergency cleaning company, and then called block management to get me copies of the building's security camera footage. All our main doorways and corridors had cameras, which was half the reason I'd chosen to rent there in the first place. And so the process of contacting management and obtaining copies of that day's footage was a quick and very easy one. After getting those emergency cleaners over and tipping them pretty well for how short notice the job was, I was able to get into my apartment probably by around 9:30. I made some coffee, sat down on my laptop, and just started sifting through the footage that block management had placed in an online Dropbox for me. Now, it took me a while to get to the right section of that footage, but sometime in the early afternoon, some hooded figure approached my apartment building's main entrance. This guy was also wearing a hoodie and ball cap combo, but unlike the guy in the parking lot that morning, this guy was also wearing a hoodie and ball cap combo, but unlike the guy in the parking lot that morning, this one appeared to be wearing a fluorescent vest while carrying a package. Now, assuming that he was a delivery guy, I figured that he was going to walk to an apartment, deliver the package, and then turn around and leave. But he didn't. Instead, he walked up to my apartment, put the package down, and then dropped his pants, and as you know, browned all over my door. When he finished, he didn't even wipe. He just pulled his pants back up and then walked out of the building so calmly that it was almost like it were an everyday thing for this guy. And I could barely believe what I was seeing. But there it was, clear as day, and maybe the weirdest thing to me at the time was, it wasn't even the same hoodie and ball cap guy that I'd seen that morning. Or at least I was 90% sure that it wasn't. He was too tall, too broad, and although I had a massive hunch that the two people were connected, I had zero clues as to why they were targeting me. I called the cops, but they were no help whatsoever, and even suggested that I try and rule out the possibility that it was a friend of mine pulling some kind of prank. And after I very politely explained that I didn't have any friends that would poop on my door, they said that they'd be in touch if there were any developments, and kind of laughed. But it was me who called them back the very next morning. I woke up at 6:15, completed my morning routine, and walked down to the parking lot to find my car had been near destroyed in the middle of the night. I called work, told my boss what had happened, and he very kindly gave me the day off so I could talk to the cops and arrange alternative transportation. Now, when I called the cops, I spoke to a different department about my car getting trashed, but they seemed just as useless as the first time that I called. They said that they'd review all the security camera footage I could provide, but since all the hooded perps' faces were covered, I knew that there wasn't much that they'd be able to do with it. And I only barely found the motivation to email it over to the address they provided, and then by early evening, I was starting to have some very worrying thoughts. Since I was obviously being targeted at home, it seemed foolish to continue staying in my apartment. And so after my car got towed away for repair, I found a decent-looking 3-star hotel that had some vacancies nearby and then took a taxi there to make a booking. I called my dad from the hotel room, just to ask his advice and whatnot, and he agreed that it was very concerning that his group of people seemed to know where I lived. It was one thing for some a-hole to target my car after seeing me drive it, but it was another for this hooded pooper to know exactly which door to do his business on. There was also a clear pattern of escalation, so logically speaking, the next thing that they were going to do was attempt to attack me in my apartment, which, as it turns out, is exactly what they tried to do. I had no idea who they were, and technically I still don't know, but at the time, it made the whole thing doubly frightening and confusing for me. Like, how in the hell had such a conflict suddenly started over a staring contest and a brief exchange of words, and who the hell were the guys targeting me? Were they a gang or something? Were they brothers, cousins, maybe even just friends, and I just so happened to have messed with the crazy one? And besides all of that, how far were these guys willing to take this? Well, apparently as far as breaking into my apartment and smashing the entire place to smithereens. So remember how I mentioned booking that hotel room? Well, I decided if I was going to stay there for a week or more, then I was going to hit up my apartment to take care of a few things, and then grab a few home comforts to take back to my hotel. And after work, I took a cab back to my apartment, walked upstairs, then, what do you know? My apartment door is hanging off of its hinges, and one of my neighbors is just sort of standing there, looking like he's seen a ghost. When I walk inside, I understand why. Whoever broke into my apartment had trashed the entire place. The glass in my shower was smashed. They destroyed my bed frame, and then the TV room and kitchenette were both carpeted with chunks of glass and porcelain from where they'd been doing Chappie impressions with the contents of my cabinets. That's a terrible baseball reference, by the way. They'd torn up all the art that had been on my walls. My TV and laptop had been obliterated, but by far the worst and most hurtful thing, they smashed my fish tank, and they killed all my fish. I was devastated. Genuinely and soul-shatteringly devastated. To F with me and my stuff? Whatever, man. But to dry drown my fish like that, to hurt innocent little creatures, just living their happy little SeaWorld lives. It took everything I had not to just have a total breakdown in front of my neighbor. Now cut to about an hour later from that, I'm back in my hotel room and I'm faced with two very cold, hard facts. Firstly, I was going to have to call the cops for the third time in as many days, and secondly, I had no choice but to find another place to live. But still, the thread that ran through all 3 days and the thing that had me practically tearing my own teeth out in frustration was obviously why? It didn't make any sense. Not anymore. Some psycho trashing my car and pooping on my door because we had a minor confrontation. There was a sort of perverse logic to that, especially if there was some homeless guy on drugs. But I was just left there asking myself, if I was home that night, would they have killed me? And how had things managed to escalate to the point that in just 3 days, all of this from a minor confrontation? It was like a nightmare, one I'd have done anything to wake up from, but it wasn't over just yet, not by a long shot. First off, when I got the security camera footage from block management, who by this point were not happy with all the trouble I was bringing home, I saw that it was the usual suspects, so to speak. Instead of a group of hooded hoodlums bursting into my apartment, similar to the group that had trashed my car, these guys looked different. They were wearing all black, with face masks and gloves. They looked like pros. It was almost terrifying. And that's the point that I decided that I was never going to lay my head there ever again, and I started looking for new places to live. But then a few days later, there was another serious escalation. One that made me realize that finding a new place to live might not solve anything at all. Now, I'd taken to riding the metro to and from Grand Central, but that meant walking several blocks from the station to our office building. Now, I actually didn't mind all that much. It gave me a chance to get a bite to eat after work, and the metro seemed considerably more civilized than the subway. And then, coupled with the peace of mind it gave me, knowing that I wasn't headed anywhere I could be targeted, it made for quite a nice change of pace. But then one day, as I'm turning from Park Avenue onto East 47th, I hear someone call my name. I was just walking along, eating my little box of halal cart street meats and fries, and I hear someone yell my name in a way that suggested that they were glad to see me. And that's the only reason I turned around in the first place. If they'd sounded mad or literally anything but as happy as they sounded, I'd have kept my eyes forward and picked up the pace in the hopes of losing them in the crowd. But they didn't sound mad. They sounded almost excited, so I turned, expecting to see an old friend or old coworker or something. But instead, I see a total stranger, and this stranger jogs up to me and just sort of goes, boom, and punches me square in the face. I fall backwards. My street meats go tumbling all over me, and the stranger goes running off, still shouting my name, but also adding stuff like, "You suck, dude. You suck." Now, it being New York, only 3 of the maybe 24 people who saw me get decked were like, "Oh, damn, you okay, buddy?" and walked over to see if I was okay. And needless to say, I was not. At that point, I had had a few days of nothing happening. I had a ton of crap to deal with in terms of getting my car roadworthy again and finding a new place to live, and I still had the mystery of the whole thing bearing down on me. But there was this short period where I thought that the worst had come and gone. Something weird and effed up was going on, but once they figured out where I lived, finding me was a piece of cake, I guess. But after the punch, I realized they, whoever they were somehow able to track me during my commute. Realizing that I wasn't safe anywhere, possibly not even in my own goddamned hotel room, this took everything to a whole nother level of stress and fear for me. And it might sound pathetic to some, so might as well say it like it is, but I literally wanted to run home to my mommy and daddy. I just didn't know where else to turn to, because the police had only just started to take things seriously, and by that point I was obviously in way over my head and in serious danger. But the real dilemma was knowing that if I did head home to my parents' place, I might potentially lead my attackers there and put my parents at risk too. I couldn't even tell them how bad it had gotten by then because I knew they'd insist on intervening in some way, which, again, might put them at risk. I had the cops, and I had my boss because once they understood how serious the situation was, my employers were very understanding and basically put me on indefinite paid leave until the whole situation could be rectified. And so between the cops, my bosses, my coworkers, my soon-to-be ex-landlords, and my prospective new landlords, my phone was very active. I spent long periods of time returning phone calls and responding to text messages, and I became very accustomed to seeing my screen light up with unknown and withheld phone numbers. A few nights later, I was in a different hotel room when my phone starts buzzing on the desk with "Number Private" written on the screen. I didn't hesitate for a second. I swiped the call open, brought my phone to my ear, and was greeted by someone very well-spoken and confident who had a very deep voice. When the guy used my name, I figured it was either a cop or someone responding to a tenancy application that I'd filled out. Yet slowly but surely, I realized that call was from someone very different. He knew a lot about me, and he appeared to use the information to confirm it was actually me he was talking to. He used my name, named my employer. He even knew the address of my old apartment, the one I was planning on moving out of. I only answered one or two of his questions before I politely asked why he was calling, and that's when he introduced himself with the name Odin. Odin, which he made clear was not his real name, worked for some tech company out west, and the reason he was calling was that he had found some of my personal information on the internet. And at first, it was sort of like, okay, so what? Because I figured he was talking about my social media, or the email address and phone number listed on my employer's website. But that's not what Odin was referring to. He said my name, my old address, photos of me, and even things like my employment history were all available to read on a website he called Doxbin. And that name meant nothing to me at the time. I wasn't even sure exactly what he said, but these days, I still get a shudder when I read it or hear it spoken. For those that don't know, Doxbin was, or is, I heard it was back, but I can't say for certain, a website that you can't access via your regular internet browser. It's located on what some people call the dark web, but Odin said it's more like the deep web, and from what I understand, all you really need is a special browser and you can see all the stuff you can't see on Chrome or Internet Explorer. Odin said that I could see for myself if I wanted to follow his instructions on how to download and install that special kind of browser. But after I agreed that it'd just be faster to send me the screenshots, he did that, and I saw for myself what was written on that website. Someone, I had no idea who at this stage, had not only listed all my personal information, they also claimed that I had several convictions involving inappropriate activities with children. The post essentially said that I was masquerading as my actual self, because I was some diddler trying to relocate and make a new life for myself after charges were filed in Ohio and Illinois. And that's when it all clicked. The random guy trying to intimidate me, people pooping on my door, smashing my car, and punching me in the face, all related to that initial confrontation. It's just that initial confrontation came as a result of this wild online accusation from what I thought was a completely anonymous source. But it wasn't anonymous. Not completely, anyway. And not only had Odin used his computer wizardry to figure out who the post was from, but he seemed more than happy to share what he'd learned. And now from what I understand, the dark or deep web is mostly only accessible through anonymous browsers, and the vast majority of posts on Doxbin were from anonymous users. But Odin figured he'd do a little digging to find out who I'd pissed off so much that they'd want to ruin my life. He Googles my name, but nothing really came up, so he checks out the charges and finds the whole Doxbin post is just some elaborate lie. Odin then circles back to trying to figure out who's mad at me and ends up searching for people who have recently separated from the research company I worked for. He finds one guy who looks like he knows his way around a Tor browser, a real takes-one-to-know-one kind of deal. He then discovers his kindred spirit has a blog on the surface web, something he can peruse at his leisure. And that's when he realizes that the writing styles of his posts and the one on Doxbin revealing my info are almost identical. Odin explained all that for about a minute or two before I practically begged him to tell me the name of the suspect. And then when he told me, it was like this sort of holy crap moment where everything suddenly came together and started making sense. I don't want to say the guy's name. I'd rather take the high ground and not dox the doxer, so to speak, but I immediately recognized it from a review I'd conducted, which had just so happened to contribute to this guy's severance from the company. He was lazy, unkempt, rarely showed up on time, and barely got his work done. But apparently beneath the greasy surface, our boy was as skilled with a computer as he was vindictive. And then when he got wind that it was me that conducted his review, well, my fate was sealed. I remember sitting on the hotel bed, my phone in one hand, head in the other, massaging my temples between my thumb and ring finger trying to stave off the incoming migraine. I think it was a case of too much information all at once, as well as swinging back and forth between thinking the call was just another prank and believing Odin was genuine. But I think by the time he dropped the name of the guy who got fired, I figured Odin knew way too much about everything for it to be a ruse. He was also willing to share everything except his identity, so unless it was all some elaborate scam, he seemed to be genuinely on my side. But here's the part where the paranoia returned with a vengeance, because towards the end of the call, Odin asked for money. He claimed he'd be able to take down the post about me. But since it was a time-critical situation, in that the longer it stayed up, the longer I'd be at risk, he'd need help breaking into the website so he could get the job done. And that meant asking some friends if they'd help him out, and those friends would require financial compensation for their efforts. Basically, if I transferred Odin a few $1,000s in Bitcoin, he could make the whole thing go away. And right away, alarm bells started going off in my head. I actually asked him, straight up, if it was him that had posted my info as a sort of roundabout way of blackmailing me into taking it down. And then he sort of laughed nervously and then admitted that did have a certain devious genius to it, but if all he really wanted was money, there were 100 ways he could scam or extort me, all without having to take the time to call and explain this whole terrible situation. And that's another thing that convinced me that he was legitimate. I'm well aware that he might have been playing the long game, and that maybe the deception was, I don't know, all part of the game for him. But whoever Odin was, he made me an offer I couldn't refuse. An offer that was in such good faith that he offered to take the post down prior to asking for payment. He didn't need to inform me of what he was capable of doing should I choose not to pay him, and I had a pretty good idea from experience, so I did. But not after 10 whole days went by without incident. He checked in every day, sort of as a reminder that I owed him, but also just to make sure nothing else had happened. He said that there was every chance my old apartment might be targeted again, but only by guys who already knew where I lived and still believed I was some kind of child predator. But with the post taken down, there hopefully wouldn't be anyone else planning on teaching me a lesson, or however the guy's post phrased it. But I was skeptical. I mean, there was still that voice in the back of my mind saying, "You just got scammed." But as the days went by and there were no further incidents at my old apartment building, that voice got quieter and quieter before being silenced completely. On the 10th day, I converted Odin's money into Bitcoin and finally sent it over to his wallet in this very complex process. And he then called me to offer a brief word of thanks, but the call ended with me thanking him, and pretty profusely too. As it happened to be so, when we ended the call, I decided to call him back just a few minutes later to ask if I could ever enlist his services again should I require them, and no sooner had I hit dial that I heard this dull-toned, but. The number had been disconnected. A few days went by, and the more I thought about this whole mess, the more that creeping sense of paranoia started to return. I became more and more convinced that Odin had been the one responsible for the whole ordeal, at least until I realized that there was a way I could kind of verify if what he'd told me was true or not. I called in a favor with one of the ladies in HR, then one afternoon, while I was still staying in that hotel room, I dialed a number that I had written on a piece of paper and hit call. Seconds later, I heard a voice on the other end of the phone. It was the guy whose review I'd conducted, the one who ended up getting fired as a result, and after putting on the cheeriest voice possible, I began to speak. I told him who it was, told him I'd learned of his severance, and then told him how sorry I was to hear about it. He sounded surprised, but not scared, so I just kind of carried on. I told him that I'd heard about a potential opportunity at another company and asked if he'd like me to keep him informed of any vacancies. Again, he sounded confused, but he told me sure, and that he'd like that. I ended the call by saying how good it was to hear from him again. It was all a lie, but one I wanted to gauge his reaction with. I wanted to hear the hatred in his voice. I wanted anything to confirm that he'd been motivated to try and ruin my entire life. But the thing that got him was this. Right as I was about to hang up and we were trapped in that meandering exchange of thanks for calling and talk to you soon maybe, I told him, "I know what you did." I believe an innocent person would have at the very minimum replied with something sort of like, "Huh? Did what?" But he didn't say a single goddamned word. And for a brief moment, it sounded like he was going to say something, like he was thinking or deciding on some killer comeback to zing me. But he didn't. He just hung up. And that was all I needed. Odin hadn't been lying to me, or if he was in cahoots with the guy who posted that, and then I got to take my hat off to just a well-laid-out scam. But something about the way the guy said nothing, it was almost like he knew he was being recorded, or you can bet your bottom dollar that I filmed the whole thing using my laptop camera, just on the off chance that I'd force an admission. He knew that he couldn't prove anything, not if he kept his mouth shut and didn't gloat about it, so, in the end, I guess he got away with it. But I got what I wanted. What seemed more important than anything else by that stage was peace of mind. I saw the cause and effect clear as day, and though it made for one hell of a ride, I could finally make some sense of what had been happening to me. I don't live in New York anymore. I don't even live on the East Coast, and nor do I still work in market research. And I'm happy, I'll say that much. But at this stage, I'm far too jaded to post anything too revealing in online spaces. And to anyone who reads this, I implore you, be very careful regarding what personal information you allow to be posted online, because there are some deeply disturbed people out there who will jump at the chance to use it against you. I first became interested in the dark web during my second year of university. I was taking a module on cybersecurity when the subject came up during a seminar, and it seemed like this mysterious, almost mythical corner of the internet that few people truly understood. I read articles and watch videos about it, some sensationalized, others more technical, and I was fascinated by the idea of this vast hidden network lying just beneath the surface. I won't lie, I was curious regarding the darker side of things, but it wasn't where my interests were rooted. I wanted to understand the technology, the architecture, as well as what purpose it might have in the online landscape of tomorrow. Accessing it turned out to be easier than I'd imagined. I downloaded the Tor browser, which is designed to anonymize your online activity by routing traffic through a series of volunteer-operated servers, and then to be extra cautious, I used a VPN for another layer of security. Navigating the dark web wasn't like using Google, where everything is indexed and easy to find. Instead, you have to use directories like the Hidden Wiki to locate onion sites. And to learn how to do that, I joined forums to learn the ropes from people who had been exploring the dark web for years. And once I was ready, I began exploring. At first, my discoveries were at best surprisingly harmless and sometimes wholesome, and at worst, only mildly unsettling. I found a lot of resources dedicated to online privacy, such as guides on using encrypted messaging apps or secure email platforms, and advice on avoiding surveillance. These weren't tools for criminals either. A big portion of the market seemed to be people like journalists and activists in countries with oppressive governments, which was a very cool aspect that hadn't even occurred to me until that point. But then a lot of users seemed to just be regular people who appeared to greatly value their digital privacy. But while some people simply trying to get ahead in a changing world of online activity, others exhibited decidedly unhealthy tendencies. For example, there was a small contingent of users who believed that they were the victims of what's called gang stalking. Gang stalking refers to the belief that a person is being systematically harassed by a coordinated group. They often describe constant surveillance, sabotage, social isolation, and public intimidation orchestrated by strangers, acquaintances, or even authorities like the federal government. It's true that a handful of isolated cases of organized harassment have been recorded, but what's important to keep in mind is that most reports of gang stalking lack any kind of evidence whatsoever and can often be caused by things like paranoia, anxiety, and other serious psychiatric conditions. The level of paranoia sufferers experience causes them to misinterpret ordinary events as deliberate threats, which can sometimes have devastating results for their friends and families. And some of what I saw unfolding on the gang stalking forum was as disheartening as it was disturbing. People's entire lives had fallen to pieces, but instead of accepting help from family or friends, they turned inward, formed secretive online communities, and actively encouraged each other's delusions. And sometimes it appeared to have deadly consequences. For me, exploring the dark web started as an academic curiosity, but quickly became something deeper. It made me think more critically about privacy, surveillance, and how technology shapes our freedoms. The dark web didn't seem inherently good or bad. It was just a tool, and what seemed to matter most was the intent of those who used it. But as I spent more time exploring, I inevitably began to come across things that hinted at its darker side. It was gradual, almost like peeling back layers of something you're not entirely sure you want to see. There were mentions of marketplaces where illegal goods were traded, forums where people discussed activities that were clearly unethical or overtly criminal. And these weren't things that I actively sought out. They were just there, scattered amidst the harmless content. But it was the rumors of so-called red rooms that marked my first tentative steps into the deep web's darkest recesses. These were said to be live-streamed events where unspeakable acts were performed on camera for an audience willing to pay in cryptocurrency. Some claimed that they were the stuff of urban legend, exaggerated or entirely fabricated to add to the dark web's infamy. Others spoke about them with eerie detail, describing how you'd need to find hidden links and pay a steep price for access. Even though I hadn't yet seen anything that confirmed their existence, the very idea was chilling. But what really struck me about the darker corners of the deep web were how casually some people discussed such topics. In certain forums, people discussed things that were morally repugnant as if they were just innocent curiosities. It felt like stepping into a world where societal norms had been stripped away and anonymity had created a space where anything, no matter how horrifying, could flourish. Despite the darkness, I kept reminding myself why I was there in the first place, to understand, not to engage. I was careful to avoid clicking on anything suspicious or venturing too far into places I didn't belong. Still, it was impossible not to feel the weight of what the dark web could be. For every encrypted email service or activist forum, there seemed to be an equally sinister counterpart lurking in the shadows. The rumors of so-called red rooms lingered in the back of my mind as I continued exploring. They were whispered about in forums and chat rooms, yet always elusive and always unconfirmed. And at first I too dismissed them as nothing but digital urban legends, nothing but the product of overactive imaginations. But the more I read, the more I started to realize they weren't entirely the stuff of myth. It felt like an unsettling puzzle, one I wasn't sure I wanted to solve, but I couldn't resist trying to uncover the truth. My search began with forums where users claimed to have insider knowledge. The posts were cryptic, filled with vague hints and coded language. Some people described red rooms as pay-to-view live-stream services where horrific acts were performed on camera, often at the request of an audience. Others dismissed the idea as impossible, pointing out the technical difficulties of streaming live video anonymously through Tor. However, there were enough detailed accounts to keep me intrigued, enough to make me wonder if some twisted corner of the internet had found a way to make it real. I followed the leads cautiously, moving through layers of forums, chat rooms, and directories, but the deeper I went, the more the atmosphere seemed to change. Places felt heavier, darker even, and I came across sites with names that felt like warnings, their plain black and white pages filled with ominous links. Some required passwords or cryptocurrency to proceed, and I hesitated. I didn't want to cross a line that I couldn't uncross, but part of me was driven by a need to know. Were these simply dead ends, or were they actually the real McCoy? And the most unnerving moments came when I found threads where people claimed to have attended those supposed events. They spoke about encrypted invitations, exorbitant Bitcoin payments, and fleeting access to streams hosted on obscure servers. It was all so surreal, yet the way they described it felt disturbingly plausible. I never found anything definitive, no actual links, no concrete evidence, but the process alone was chilling. The deeper I dug, the more I realized that even the search itself carried risks. Not just of stumbling upon something horrific, but of crossing a boundary that I wasn't willing to cross. Whether or not red rooms actually exist almost seemed irrelevant toward the end, because the pursuit alone had revealed an incredibly unsettling truth about what people are capable of imagining. I logged off, shaken by the experience, but also strangely relieved that I hadn't found what I was looking for. The rumors remained just that, rumors. But the darkness I glimpsed along the way felt all too real. And in the end, it was that feeling of being so close to finding something that dragged me back down that rabbit hole. I still remember the moment I found it. It was the culmination of weeks of following cryptic threads, chasing rumors, and piecing together fragments of a puzzle that I wasn't even sure I wanted to solve. It came unexpectedly, after hours of trawling through hidden forums and dead links. A new thread had appeared in one of the darker corners of a forum posted by someone who claimed to have access to a real red room. And the post was sparse, just a brief description, a heavily encrypted link, and a demand for payment in Bitcoin. I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to stop, to close the browser and walk away, but I couldn't. The curiosity that had driven me this far refused to let me quit. I transferred the required Bitcoin, an amount that made my chest tighten as I watched it leave my wallet and follow the instructions. The link took me to a blank page with a countdown timer. It felt surreal, like stepping into the setup of some macabre horror film. I waited, my heart rate beginning to quicken as I questioned every decision which led me to that moment. When the countdown hit 0, the screen flickered, and a grainy video feed appeared. The room was very stark and clinical, lit by harsh fluorescent lights that cast sharp shadows on the walls. A man in a lab coat stood in the center, surrounded by equipment that looked cobbled together, medical monitors, steel tables, and tools whose purposes I didn't want to imagine. The camera panned slowly, revealing a figure strapped to one of the tables. They were conscious, but their face was contorted with fear and their muffled cries were audible even through their gag and the poor audio quality. The chat panel beside the video feed erupted with activity. Anonymous viewers typed messages, some urging the host to proceed, others asking for specific acts or experiments. It was horrifying, not just because of what I was seeing, but because of the casualness of the audience. They treated it like a spectacle, something to be ordered and consumed, as if the person on the table wasn't even a human being to begin with. I don't know if they believed it was fake or something, and that's why they were able to talk that way, but to me, it looked very real. The experiments began, and I could barely stomach it. The host used injections, electrical currents, and other devices that seemed designed to test pain thresholds or biological responses. The victim writhed and screamed, their agony evident through the screen. The audience cheered, their requests growing more depraved with every passing moment. And it was unlike anything I'd ever imagined. Pure, unfiltered cruelty masquerading as scientific inquiry. I don't know how long I watched before I forced myself to close the browser and slam close my laptop. I sat there in silence, feeling sick. My hands trembled, and I felt an overwhelming sense of guilt for even having gone that far. The reality of what I'd seen was far worse than any rumor or legend. It wasn't just a myth. This was real, and it was happening somewhere, hidden in the depths of the shadowy network. That night I deleted everything. The Tor browser, my Bitcoin wallet, the logs I kept of my search. I wanted no trace of what I'd done, no connection to the sickening, skin-crawling world that I had taken a glimpse into. But those images stayed with me. They're things I'll never fully forget, as long as I live, and I suppose that's something that I have to deal with, alone. I'd always been curious about the so-called dark web. I'd heard a bunch of stories about its deeper, darker corners, places no one should go, filled with things that no one should see. Now, it might sound creepy, but it got me pretty curious. But I could never be prepared for what I found when I stumbled across the Cannibal Cafe. It started innocently enough. Late-night boredom, a rabbit hole of clicks, and then suddenly, I was there. The site was crude. Its design basic and outdated, but its purpose was clear. It was a gathering place for people with tastes that went beyond acceptable norms. It claimed to be fictional, but the posts felt too real, too detailed. I thought it was just another forum for sick fantasies. And then I saw the classifieds. People weren't just talking about cannibalism. They were either offering themselves up or asking for someone else to become meat. The language was careful, vague enough to avoid outright confession, but the user's intentions were unmistakable. It wasn't just some dumb site for sick role players. It was real. I should have clicked away, closed my laptop, and just gone to bed. But instead, I stayed. Part of me thought it was all some elaborate joke, some twisted forum for entertainment, and I told myself that I was just observing and that I wasn't a part of it, just a tourist passing through. And then I found it. It was a journal entry written by someone who claimed to have actually cannibalized another person. He didn't use his real name, none of them did, but the way he described everything, the way he wrote, it made it sound like the God's honest truth. He talked about meeting a man online, someone who was tired of living, and then they agreed to meet. He would end him, butcher him, and eat him, and the man actually wanted it. And I felt sick reading it, but I couldn't stop. He described the meeting in a way that made it sound almost normal, like two friends getting together. They had dinner first, an actual meal, as if to ease into what was coming, and then the man who wrote the journal led the other man to a room he had prepared for the occasion. He claimed to have covered everything in plastic, set up tools, knives, and hooks. It sounded clean, clinical even, and it absolutely horrified me. The man who was tired of living, who was called the volunteer, was told to strip down and lay on the table. He was calm. He brought a letter, a sort of contract explaining his consent, and the writer said that he asked one last time if he was sure, and he claimed the volunteer smiled and nodded. And then it began. The description of what followed made my stomach churn. He wrote about the knife, the blood, the way the man's body reacted. He wrote about the sounds, the smell, and he was careful and precise. He didn't rush. He said it was important to honor the volunteer's wishes, to make it meaningful. There was no anger, no rage, just a kind of reverence. He described the meat, the way it looked, the texture. He wrote about cooking it, seasoning it, and then finally, eating it. I should have stopped reading, but I couldn't. It was like watching a slow-motion car crash or something. Horrifying, but impossible not to watch. The way he wrote made it feel real, more real than anything I'd ever read before, but it wasn't just the details. It was the emotion the guy put into his writing that really sent chills through me. He wasn't writing to brag or shock anyone. He was confessing, unburdening himself almost. There was a sadness in his words, too, a weight to them, as if what he'd done had changed him in ways he didn't fully understand yet. When I finally closed my laptop, it was early morning and the sun was creeping through the blinds. I felt nauseous and hollow, like something had been done that couldn't be undone. And I tried telling myself it wasn't real, that it was just some story, but I couldn't forget the way it was written. The details, the emotion. It stayed with me, gnawing at my thoughts as I showered, toweling off, and then drifted off to sleep after climbing into bed. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I tried to distract myself, but nothing worked. The story kept replaying in my head over and over again, and I started dreaming about it. Nightmares where I was the volunteer lying on the table, waiting for the knife, and I'd wake up sweating with my heart racing and my mouth parched and dry. I told myself I wouldn't go back to that site, but the pull was too strong. I needed to know more. I needed to understand, and so I did return. The journal entry was still there along with the others. More stories, more confessions. Some were less detailed and others more so. Some sounded fake, exaggerated, but others had that chilling ring of truth to them, just like the first one I'd read. I started reading them all, one by one, each more horrifying than the last, and I didn't eat meat for almost 2 weeks around that time. I couldn't look at it without imagining the descriptions from the stories, but at the same time I couldn't keep away. I became obsessed, spending hours on the site, diving deeper into its archives, noticing patterns and connections between different posts. Some of the users seemed to know each other, referencing past events or sharing tips. It was a full-on cannibalistic community hidden just below the surface of the regular internet. One night, I found a new post. It was from the same user who had written the journal entry that started it all. He was back, sharing another story, only this time, it was different. He wrote about the aftermath, about how he couldn't stop thinking about it. He said he craved that feeling of godlike power again. He tried to live a normal life, but it was impossible. The taste of the meat, the act itself, he felt like they'd changed him. He wrote about finding another volunteer, someone else who was tired of living. He described the process again, but this time it felt darker, more desperate. He wasn't honoring anyone's wishes anymore. He was feeding his addiction. The reverence was gone, replaced by depravity, and he wrote about the guilt, the shame, but also the satisfaction, the way it filled the void inside him and the peace that brought him, if only for a moment. During those 2 or 3 days where I was glued to Cannibal Cafe, I stopped leaving my apartment. I avoided friends, family, and anyone who might notice the change in me, and my world shrank to the glow of my laptop screen and the endless stream of stories and posts. The dreams got worse. They weren't nightmares anymore. They were vivid, detailed, and I wasn't the volunteer anymore. I was the one holding the knife. It took a long talk with a close friend to realize that my obsession with Cannibal Cafe was the symptom of some lingering depression I'd been wrestling with following the death of my father. Now, that might sound very random to some people, but I guess I wasn't fully in touch with my own emotions regarding his passing. Reading about that clinical process of death and dismemberment forced me to confront them in ways I wasn't entirely aware of at the time. And then after talking to my friend about it, it's like it unlocked this new perspective. I stopped visiting the Cannibal Cafe, and for a long time it was out of my mind, until I heard about the owner getting arrested in Germany for actually killing and eating somebody, just like the person had described in the post. I managed to half convince myself that, in reality, the site was nothing but an elaborate fantasy run by some very disturbed individuals. But hearing about that guy, Armin Maivas, arrested, shattered that delusion, and had made me realize that the world really is much darker than I was led to believe. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations,